Robert Wallace was 58 years old, his company built over 30 years of sacrifice, and he was certain he knew every person around him until the day he returned home from the hospital earlier than expected and found, in the place where he kept the most important secrets of his life, the woman he trusted most, silently rummaging through everything. He said nothing. She said nothing. And it was precisely that silence that began to destroy everything within him. Because what lay behind that scene was far greater, far more calculated, and far more painful than anything he could possibly imagine while still standing in his own hallway, suitcase in hand and heart shattered. And stick with this story because it will surprise you until the very last word. The suitcase hit the hardwood floor of the hallway with a dull thud, and Robert Wallace stood there, immobile, as if his feet had taken root in the very floorboards he'd had installed 15 years ago. His heart hammered in a way he knew well, that familiar vice-like grip the doctors had spent 2 weeks trying to tame with IVs, monitors and medications with names too long for him to remember. But what he was feeling now had nothing to do with high blood pressure. It was something else. It was the sight of Marlene Davis, 52 years old, her back to the office entrance, completely absorbed, running her fingers through stacks of documents kept in a drawer that should never have been opened by her. Robert didn't breathe. He stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, his eyes fixed on the back of the woman he had hired almost 4 years ago, after 3 different recommendations and 2 weeks of kitchen trials. Marlene was good at what she did. More than good. She was the kind of employee who arrived early, who never needed to be reminded of anything, who prepared the ginger vegetable broth his cardiologist had prescribed as part of his recovery diet, and who, on days he came home exhausted from work, left dinner in a foil-covered dish with a note detailing the oven time. He had trusted her with the house key, with the daily routine, with the silence he needed when he arrived and didn't want to talk to anyone. And now she was there, standing in the middle of his office, papers in her hands. Robert's instinct, the one that had survived 30 years in a competitive and unforgiving business sector, told him not to move, and he obeyed. He retreated slowly, 1 step, then 2, without taking his eyes off her, until he felt the doorknob of the front door against his back. He slipped out, closed the door carefully, went to his car and sat in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, staring at his own driveway without seeing anything. He had been discharged 3 days earlier than planned. The hypertensive crisis had been serious enough to completely terrify his son, Caleb Wallace, 31, when he arrived at the hospital that Friday night. The doctors had spoken of monitoring, medication adjustments, and absolute rest for at least 10 days after discharge. Robert had agreed to everything while hospitalized, but as soon as he started to feel better, the weight of being away from the company, the documents, the decisions that needed to be made, became unbearable. He requested discharge. The doctor resisted. Robert signed the liability waiver with the same pen he used to sign contracts. The only one who knew about the early release was David Scott, his driver for 8 years, who had picked him up from the hospital that afternoon, and who must now be waiting outside, wondering why his boss had sent him away and then just sat in his own car. Marlene didn't know he was coming. She shouldn't have known. And yet there she was. Robert stayed in the car for almost an hour. The early October sun in Austin still held that late summer quality, a dry, white heat that seeped through the windows, even when closed. He didn't turn on the air conditioning. He sat there, thinking, trying to piece together the scene in a way that made sense without having to be what it seemed to be. Maybe she had entered the office for another reason. Maybe the documents had fallen. Maybe she was looking for something related to the house, a receipt, a service note, something that would justify it. But he knew he was lying to himself. He knew Marlene well enough to know she wasn't the type to enter the office out of distraction. She had clear boundaries in her own mind about which spaces were hers and which weren't. In the 4 years she had worked in the house, she had never touched his desk. She had never opened that drawer. And Robert knew this, because it was precisely these kinds of details he noticed, that silent inventory of behaviors he kept for everyone around him. When he finally entered the house, he called her name from the hallway with a naturalness that cost him more than any physical effort he had made in years. Marlene appeared at the kitchen door with a dish towel in her hands, her face calm, her eyes slightly surprised to see him, and said she hadn't known he was coming today. Robert said he'd been discharged early. She said she would prepare something light for dinner. He said he was fine, that he just wanted to rest, and he went to his room without looking at the office, without checking the drawer, without saying anything about what he had seen. That night, lying in his own bed after 2 weeks in a hospital bed, Robert lay awake staring at the ceiling for hours. The house smelled clean, of the product Marlene used on the floors, of the rosemary she placed in the terracotta pot near the kitchen window. Everything was in its place. Everything seemed normal, and that was exactly what wouldn't let him sleep. For the next 3 days, Robert stayed home on doctor's orders, and it was during this period that he began to observe Marlene in a way he himself recognized as different. It wasn't open suspicion. It was calculated attention, the same kind he used in meetings when he wanted to understand what was happening before anyone else realized he was paying attention. He noticed the times her cell phone rang, and she went out to the backyard to answer. He noticed the times she lingered longer than necessary near the office hallway, as if listening for something. He noticed that one afternoon when he went to the kitchen for water and passed the hallway, she flipped her phone screen down too quickly to be casual. These details alone wouldn't prove anything, but together they formed a texture that Robert recognized from the business world, the texture of someone hiding something. The confirmation came in a way he hadn't expected. On Thursday afternoon, while Marlene was at the grocery store, Robert went to the office and checked the drawer. The documents were there in the same stack, but there was a subtle difference in the order of the sheets, an inversion between 2 contracts he habitually kept in chronological order. Too small to be noticed by anyone who didn't know exactly how that drawer was organized. Large enough for Robert to be certain. She had been back. Not once. More than once. Robert closed the drawer slowly, carefully, and stood there in the office for a long moment, looking out the window that overlooked the side garden of the house. The garden Marlene also took care of, because the gardener he had hired years ago had quit, and she had simply taken on that task without being asked, watering the plants in the morning before she started cooking. He had once found that charming, thought it was a sign of someone who cared about the place they worked. Now he wondered what else she had taken on without him noticing. On Friday, Robert called Caleb and said he was fine, that the rest was working, that there was nothing to worry about. Caleb, who lived in a downtown apartment and visited his father twice a week, asked if he needed anything. Robert said no. He hung up the phone and sat on the living room sofa for a long time, thinking about the son who had inherited his long nose and stubbornness, but not his business acumen, and who had never gotten involved with the company by choice. Caleb was a history teacher at a public high school and seemed happy with it. Robert respected that choice with more difficulty than he would ever admit aloud. What he definitely wasn't going to do was drag his son into this mess before he understood what was happening. On Saturday morning, while having the vegetable broth Marlene had left in a small pot on the stove with a slip of paper indicating heating time, Robert found in the kitchen trash, beneath vegetable peels and paper towels, a folded sheet with handwritten notes. Numbers. A sequence of numbers he recognized immediately. They were the identifiers for the oldest contracts of the trucking company, those defining the terms of partnership entry and exit. Robert refolded the sheet, put it in his pajama pocket, and finished the broth in silence. The name he had been trying not to think about since that Tuesday afternoon returned with a clarity that truly hurt. Victor Hayes. 63 years old, a minority partner for almost 12, a man who knew how to smile at the right times and stay silent at the wrong ones, and who, in the last 6 months, had started to pressure Robert in various, equally uncomfortable ways to sell his share of the company. He cited difficulties in the sector, declining demand, the need for restructuring. The numbers Robert knew by heart confirmed none of this. But Victor insisted, and insisted, and insisted. The hospitalization had interrupted those conversations, or at least that's what Robert had believed until now. It was becoming increasingly difficult to believe the two things were unrelated. That night, alone in the office with the drawer open in front of him, Robert looked at the documents for a long time. There was something Victor didn't know. There was something that Marlene, even if she had photographed every sheet in that stack, wouldn't have been able to deliver in a useful way. Some of those contracts had versions. The one in the drawer wasn't the original. It was a copy with slightly altered numbers, created years ago after an attempted corporate coup that Robert had never discussed with anyone but his lawyer. A fail-safe he had built as a precaution and never had to use. Until now. Robert closed the drawer carefully, turned off the office light, and went to bed. For the first time since he had crossed that hallway and seen Marlene's back with the papers in her hands, he managed to close his eyes without his heart racing. But sleep didn't come. Because along with the clarity of understanding what was happening came the pain of confirming what he had spent years trying not to believe. That the person he had trusted to care for his home, his meals, the invisible routine that kept his life running, had been placed there by someone who wanted to destroy everything he had built, and he still didn't know how far it went. The second week of October in Austin usually brought that smell of damp earth from the farms on the city's outskirts, mixed with a lingering heat that hadn't yet decided whether to stay or go. Robert woke that Monday feeling like he'd only slept a few hours, though the clock showed almost 8 in the morning. He lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the house. The soft creak of the back door Marlene always left ajar to let in the morning air, the faint clinking of pots in the kitchen, the smell of brewed coffee wafting down the hall as if nothing were wrong. It was precisely this contrast that weighed most heavily. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed the same. And Robert knew it wasn't. He rose slowly, still limited by the fatigue the hospitalization had left in his body, and went to the bathroom without a sound. He looked at his own face in the mirror longer than usual. 58 years old, hair completely white since 52, dark eyes his son had inherited, which Robert recognized in Caleb's face with a mix of pride and melancholy. It was a face that had been through a lot, a partner's bankruptcy that took a chunk of capital with it, a separation that had lasted 3 years of lawyers and long silences before becoming signed papers, a crisis in the logistics sector that had nearly swallowed the company when Caleb was still in college. Robert had navigated all of that with that specific stubbornness of someone who decides they won't fall until they've tried everything. But this was different. This was coming from inside his own home. He went down to the kitchen and found Marlene, her back to him, stirring something in a bowl. She greeted him without turning, said the broth was ready and that she'd made some homemade biscuits because the doctor had said he needed more calcium. Robert thanked her, sat at the table, and watched her work, while silently drinking his broth. Observing Marlene was, at that moment, like trying to read a book with the wrong cover. What was on the outside didn't match what he now suspected was on the inside. Marlene Davis was a woman of medium height, dark hair pulled back in a low bun that she wore every day without variation, and an expression that tended towards serious without ever becoming cold. She had come to Robert's house from a difficult situation. Recently separated, with 2 adult children living in other cities, she had restarted her professional life after years of caring for her family. The referral had come from Mrs. Evelyn, the next-door neighbor, who knew her from when they both attended the same parish. Robert had checked the references, spoken with people, and found nothing that raised any red flags. Now he kept wondering what he had missed. That morning, after Marlene left at her usual time, Robert spent 2 hours in the office reviewing the documents with surgical attention. He wasn't looking for what was missing. He was looking for what had been seen. There was an important difference between the two. If Marlene was passing information to Victor, what mattered wasn't what she had taken, but what she had understood. And to understand enough to be useful, she would need more than a quick glance into a drawer. This meant it had been going on longer than he had thought. The question that wouldn't leave his head was simple and brutal. Since when? Robert went to the shelf where he kept his personal notebooks, the ones he used to record informal meetings, conversations not for official minutes, observations he preferred not to keep in digital format. He picked up last year's notebook and began to flip through it. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was looking for a pattern. And the pattern slowly emerged, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. There were 3 instances in the last 8 months when Victor had appeared with information that could only have come from inside the company or from inside the house. Details about Robert's health that he hadn't mentioned in meetings, a reference to a specific contract that was undergoing renegotiation and that Robert was sure he hadn't mentioned to Victor. A question during a lunch, asked in passing, about the partner's right of first refusal clause in case of the principal's incapacity. That question at the time had seemed just one of Victor's many attempts to find a loophole for a forced buyout. Now it seemed like something else. Robert closed the notebook and stood holding it. The anger he felt wasn't explosive. It was the variety he knew best, the kind that burns slowly and doesn't extinguish easily. But along with the anger, there was something more complicated. The awareness that there was a part of this story he still didn't understand. How had Victor gotten to Marlene? Or how had Marlene gotten to Victor? The two had completely different implications, and Robert needed to know which was true before making any move. He called David that afternoon. David Scott was 44, Robert's driver since his youngest son had moved out, and he'd decided he no longer wanted to drive to work alone every day. He was a discreet, punctual man, with a quality Robert valued above all else. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, but he kept the ones he did ask with the care of someone who knows that wrong information can be costly. Robert asked David to discreetly check one thing: if there was any known connection between Marlene and Victor. It didn't need to be anything formal. He just wanted to know if their names crossed paths anywhere. David listened without interrupting, said he'd see what he could find, and hung up without asking why. It was exactly the kind of answer Robert needed at that moment. The days that followed were the most difficult Robert had lived in his own home, and he had already lived through difficult things there. The separation had happened in that house. His mother's wake had been held in that living room, but none of those things had the specific quality of pain of continuing to feign normalcy with someone who was betraying you while serving you breakfast. Marlene continued to come every day. She continued to prepare meals. She continued to care for the house with that silent competence Robert had admired for years, and Robert continued to observe, mentally noting, building a map of behaviors that grew more detailed each day. On Wednesday, he noticed she had entered the office while he was in the backyard, doing the short walk the doctor had recommended. There was nothing different about the documents when he checked later, but there was a slight displacement in the chair, as if someone had sat in it briefly. Too small to be noticed by anyone who hadn't spent years developing the habit of noticing what was out of place. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now, hit the bell icon, and tell us where you're watching from. Returning to the story. On Thursday, Marlene's cell phone rang 3 times in less than an hour while she was preparing lunch. All 3 times she turned the device to hide the screen. On the third, she went out to the backyard for almost 10 minutes. On Friday, David called. Robert was in the office when the phone vibrated. He answered on the second ring and heard David say in his low, direct voice that he had found something. It wasn't an obvious connection. They weren't people who knew each other personally, at least not that he had been able to ascertain. But there was a common name: Gerald Rivers, 56 years old, owner of a small real estate agency in downtown Austin, Victor's brother-in-law through his first wife, and also, as David had discovered by talking to Mrs. Evelyn's nephew, a neighbor on the same street where Marlene lived. Mrs. Evelyn's nephew, who frequented the same gym as Gerald, had mentioned that the two greeted each other with familiarity. Nothing that proved anything, but enough for Robert to understand the geometry of it. Victor had gotten to Marlene through Gerald. A chain of 3 people, discreet enough not to raise suspicion, built on neighborhood relationships and everyday trust. Robert hung up the phone and looked out the office window. Outside, the garden Marlene watered every morning was green and well-tended, the begonias she had transplanted in August opening their first orange buds. It was beautiful. It was genuine. And it was impossible to tell, looking at it, where the woman who cared for plants out of habit ended, and the woman who was being used by someone to destroy what that house represented began. This uncertainty was the most unsettling thing of all, because Robert, no matter how much anger and suspicion tried to simplify the situation, couldn't help but consider a possibility that changed everything. What if Marlene didn't know exactly what she was doing? What if she was just another piece in a game Victor had carefully orchestrated, offering her something she needed that made the betrayal seem smaller than it was? This question had no answer yet, and Robert knew that trying to answer it without more information would be a mistake. On Saturday afternoon, Caleb came to visit. He arrived with a homemade meal he'd prepared himself, having called his father during the week and grown concerned about his recovery. and found Robert sitting on the porch reading the newspaper with an expression his son described as strange, different. Robert said it was just fatigue. Caleb looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that were identical to his father's and said it looked like more than just fatigue. Robert closed the newspaper and asked about school. Caleb got the message and didn't press further. They sat on the porch for almost an hour, drinking coffee Caleb had made himself since Marlene didn't work Saturdays, and talking about things that had nothing to do with either of the real problems on Robert's mind. When Caleb left in the late afternoon, Robert stood on the porch watching the gate close. The sun was setting behind the street trees, painting the sky that characteristic Austin orange on October afternoons, and the city hummed its usual background noise. Birds on the wires, a distant horn, the neighbor's dog barking at the same time every day. Everything normal, everything the same. Except that on the following Monday, when Robert arrived at the company office for the first time since his hospitalization, he would have to face Victor Hayes face to face, sit at the same table, shake the same hand, and pretend he knew nothing. And what kept him awake that night wasn't anger. It was the growing certainty that there was something he still didn't know, something Victor needed from those documents with an urgency that went beyond a common partnership dispute. An urgency that justified the risk of involving a household employee in such a delicate maneuver. What was in those contracts that Victor so desperately needed? Robert didn't have the answer yet, but he knew that starting Monday, the game would move to the next phase. The headquarters of Wallace Logistics was on a quiet street in Austin's industrial district, in a simple fronted warehouse that Robert had renovated 3 times over the years without ever losing that appearance of a place that truly works, without frills. There was a discreet sign at the entrance, with the company name in black letters on a white background, and a narrow garden in front that the reception staff cared for on their own initiative, without anyone having asked. Robert had always liked that. It was the kind of detail that said something about the people who worked in a place. That Monday morning, when David's car pulled up to the warehouse at 8:20, Robert paused for a moment in the back seat before opening the door. David said nothing. He simply waited, hands on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. This was the kind of silence Robert had learned to value in his driver over 8 years, a silence that didn't pressure. Robert opened the door and got out. The impact of entering the company after almost 3 weeks was physical, almost like a scent you didn't know you'd missed until you encountered it again. The hum of computers in the operations room, the voices of dispatchers on the phone, the drone of the air conditioning that had never worked quite right in the central hallway, and that no one had managed to definitively fix in 5 years of attempts. Everything there, everything functioning. Robert greeted each person he met along the way with handshakes and brief words, because that's how he had always done it, and because anything different that morning would be a signal he didn't want to send. Victor Hayes was in the meeting room when Robert arrived in the administrative area. He was standing near the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, talking to Priscilla Adams, 38, the company's financial manager for 6 years, and one of the few people Robert considered completely trustworthy within that space. When Victor saw Robert enter, the smile that appeared on his face was wide and immediate, the kind Robert had learned to read over 12 years of partnership, a smile that arrived before the emotion. The two greeted each other with a handshake that lasted a second longer than necessary. Victor said he was relieved to see Robert back, that he had been worried about his hospitalization, that the company wasn't the same without him. He said all this with the fluency of someone who had practiced the words before speaking. Robert listened, thanked him, made the usual comments about his recovery, and sat at the head of the meeting table with the naturalness of someone on their own territory, because that was exactly what he needed to project. Priscilla left the room with a discreet excuse that Robert recognized as consideration. She had noticed something in the temperature between the two, he was sure. Priscilla was good at that. They were left alone in the room. Victor began to talk about the company, even before Robert had opened any documents. He brought up operational numbers from the last week, commented on 2 freight contracts that were up for renewal, mentioned a conversation with a major client as if it were a routine update. Robert listened attentively, responded briefly, and mentally built an inventory of what Victor was choosing to mention and what he was choosing not to mention. There was an art to omission that Robert had learned to read in difficult negotiations, and Victor was good at it, but not as good as he believed himself to be. What Victor didn't mention, the right of first refusal clause he had tried to activate 3 weeks before Robert's hospitalization. The informal meeting he had scheduled and then cancelled with the company's lawyer the week Robert was in the hospital. And the visit he had made to the company the previous Thursday, as Priscilla had informed him via text message that morning, a visit that had not been communicated to Robert and had lasted almost 2 hours. Robert let the silence settle naturally at the end of Victor's update. Then he asked, with the same calm voice he used to sign contracts, about the reason for Thursday's visit. Victor's face didn't change dramatically. He was a controlled man. But there was something in his eyes, a brief contraction before he said he had come to check some operational reports that needed attention, that he had informed Priscilla, that he thought everything was in order. Robert nodded slowly, said it was good to know. And he changed the subject with a naturalness that left Victor slightly off balance, because changing the subject robbed him of the opportunity to elaborate further on his explanation, and a man with a guilty conscience always wants to elaborate. For the next hour, they worked together on the operational documents with the mechanical efficiency of two partners who have known each other for a long time and don't need much conversation to function. But Robert was doing two things at once, dealing with the company's real business and observing Victor's every micro-reaction when certain topics arose. There was a specific contract, the renewal with a regional carrier from upstate New York, that briefly appeared on a spreadsheet. When Robert mentioned it in passing, Victor's gaze shifted for an instant. Too fast to be intentional, too slow to go unnoticed. That contract would need attention. Robert ended the meeting before lunch, saying he still needed to rest, doctor's orders. Victor said he understood, that there was no rush, that the company was in good hands. Robert thanked him with a smile that had taken years to learn, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but that no one notices at the time. On his way out, he stopped at Priscilla's office. She looked up from her computer and waited, which was another sign of a good employee. She waited for the other person to start. Robert closed the door behind him and asked, without preamble, what exactly Victor had done during those 2 hours on Thursday. Priscilla chose her words carefully. She said Victor had requested access to the physical files of the partnership agreements, claiming he needed to review a clause for a consultation with his accountant. She said she had accompanied him for most of the time, but had stepped out for about 15 minutes to handle an urgent client call, and when she returned, Victor was sitting with the documents open on the table. She said he hadn't removed anything, at least not that she had noticed. But he had taken photos with his cell phone. Robert stood still for a moment. Then he asked if she had said anything. Priscilla said no, that she wasn't sure if it was her place to say, that she had been waiting for him to return. Robert nodded, said she had done the right thing, to keep doing exactly what she was doing, and that if Victor again requested access to any physical files without his express authorization, she should say the files were under review. Priscilla wrote something down on a small notepad that always sat beside her keyboard. She didn't ask anything else. It was the kind of loyalty that didn't need explanation to function. Back in the car, Robert remained silent the entire way home. David didn't ask anything. He dropped him at the door and left with a discreet nod. The afternoon was long. Robert spent part of it in his home office, mentally reorganizing what he knew and what he still needed to know. The piece that was still missing was the most important, what Victor intended to do with the information he had obtained, because photographed documents were worthless without an application. And the application, in the context of a partnership dispute, usually involved a lawyer or a third party with an interest in the company. It was at this point that Robert remembered something he had heard months ago, in a casual conversation during a City Chamber of Commerce event, that a group of investors from outside Austin was mapping regional logistics companies with acquisition potential. It had been mentioned in passing, no names, not enough detail to seem relevant at the time. Now it seemed very relevant. If Victor was negotiating a sale of his stake to a third party, and if that third party wanted the entire company, then what Victor needed was a way to force Robert to sell or to discredit him enough to make the continuation of the partnership untenable. The documents Marlene had accessed, if misinterpreted or presented partially, could be used to construct a narrative of mismanagement or contractual irregularity. It was a clever move. It was the kind of thing that took months to set up. Robert sat in his office chair for a long time after reaching this conclusion. The afternoon light shifted at the window, that orange glow entering through the glass and gilding the dark wood shelves, the notebooks, the picture frames with old photos. There was a photo of Caleb at 12 in a leather frame near the lamp. Messy hair, crooked smile, holding a fish he had caught with his father on a Sunday afternoon at a reservoir near the city. Robert looked at it longer than he planned. He was fighting for what he had built. He was fighting for the company that had paid for Caleb's school, Caleb's apartment, Caleb's life all those years his son needed support while deciding what he wanted to be. And he was fighting alone, as he had always fought, because that's how he knew how to do it. But for the first time in a long time, that solidity he felt in his own resolve had a small crack. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to weariness. The kind of weariness that comes not from effort, but from realizing that the effort will need to last longer than you expected. His cell phone vibrated on the desk. It was a message from David, short as always. He had gotten more information. The name of the lawyer Victor had consulted 2 weeks before Robert's hospitalization was known, in the city's business circles, not for competence, but for his specialty, forced corporate dissolutions. Robert read the message twice. He placed the cell phone on the desk and stared at it, as if the device had just confirmed something he knew and at the same time hoped wasn't true. Marlene arrived the next morning as usual. She closed the gate, hung her purse on the kitchen hook, put on her apron. Robert was sitting at the table when she entered, which was unusual because he usually came down after she had already started preparing coffee. She looked at him for a second longer than usual, and in that second there was something Robert couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to tension, to alert, to the instinct of someone who senses the environment has changed without knowing exactly how. The story continues. Robert said good morning in his usual voice. Marlene said good morning and went to make coffee. And neither of them said anything more for a long time, while the kitchen filled with the scent of morning and the city outside awoke with its usual noise, completely indifferent to the invisible thread of tension that ran through that house from side to side. There was a bakery on the street behind the company called the Daily Crumb, which had been operating since the 80s and that everyone in the industrial neighborhood knew by the smell of fresh bread wafting from its side window starting at 5 in the morning. Robert had had coffee there hundreds of times over the years, at a small table near the window that was always available at that hour because most people grabbed their pastries to go and didn't sit down. It was an unpretentious place, with white tiled walls and a ceiling fan that spun slowly even in winter, and Robert liked it precisely for that reason. It was there that he met Priscilla on Wednesday morning, 3 days after his return to the company. He had requested the meeting outside the office on purpose. Not because he distrusted the physical space, but because he knew that some conversations change their nature depending on where they happen, and what he needed to discuss with Priscilla required her to feel free to speak without the hierarchical weight of the company walls around them. Priscilla arrived punctually, with a thin folder under her arm, and that concentrated expression Robert recognized from difficult meetings. She ordered a black coffee, placed the folder on the table and said, even before he opened his mouth, that she had prepared something she thought he needed to see. Robert looked at her for a second with something akin to gratitude, an emotion he found difficult to show, and then looked at the folder. Priscilla had spent the last few nights reviewing the financial entries of the past 18 months with a care that went beyond her job obligations. What she found wasn't a clear irregularity, nothing that would jump out in a superficial audit. It was a series of small discrepancies, freight values recorded with a slightly lower margin than contracted, minimal differences that individually meant nothing but which, added up over 18 months, represented a considerable sum diverted to a vendor account that Priscilla hadn't been able to fully identify. Robert listened in silence, flipping through the pages she had printed with that neat, small handwriting that was the hallmark of her reports. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. This hadn't been put together in a hurry. It had been built patiently by someone who knew the company's systems well and knew exactly where the gaps in attention lay. He asked who had access to this level of entry. Priscilla said that besides herself, there were only 2 people, the financial assistant who had resigned 6 months ago, and Victor, who had partner access to the system but rarely used it directly, preferring to receive consolidated reports. Robert slowly closed the folder. The ceiling fans spun above them with that periodic creak that had never been fixed. Outside, the street began to stir, trucks leaving for the day's first routes, workers entering the company's side door with their hard hats in hand. He told Priscilla that she had done work that went beyond what anyone could ask, and that he needed her to continue exactly as she was, without changing anything, without confronting anyone, without giving any sign that she had noticed anything. He said that when the right moment came, her work would be crucial. Priscilla nodded, put away the folder, and drank the rest of her coffee without saying anything more. When they left the bakery, Robert stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the simple facade of the Daily Crumb with the morning sun hitting the window tiles. There was a strange lightness in having someone on his side. Not the lightness of someone sharing a burden, but that of realizing he wasn't completely alone in a terrain that had started to feel too isolated. The rest of that week was a sequence of calculated moves that Robert executed with the precision of someone playing chess, knowing the opponent hasn't yet realized they're at a disadvantage. He contacted his personal lawyer, Theodore Vance, 61, a dry and efficient man who had handled all of Robert's legal affairs since his separation and had the valuable habit of not showing surprise at any information. He gave Theodore a summary of what he knew, without mentioning Marlene yet, focusing on what Victor had done within the company and the irregularities Priscilla had identified. Theodore listened, asked 3 precise questions, and said he would need a week to build a clear legal scenario. He also said, almost in passing, that if the financial irregularities were confirmed in a formal audit, Victor's position in the partnership would become legally much more fragile than he probably calculated. Robert hung up the phone with that specific feeling when a piece fits into a place you hadn't fully anticipated, but which makes perfect sense once it happens. It was that same week that something changed in Marlene. Robert noticed it on Thursday morning, when she arrived almost 20 minutes late, which had never happened in 4 years. He said nothing. He observed. She was different that day, less fluid in her movements, with a tension in her shoulders that wasn't there before, responding with shorter sentences than usual when he commented on the weather. At lunch, she left the rice on the stove too long and stared at the wall for a moment before realizing by the smell. That wasn't the behavior of someone confidently executing a plan. It was the behavior of someone who was starting to feel the weight of something. Robert thought about this throughout the afternoon. The time had come to consider more carefully the question he had tried to avoid. What was Marlene's real role in all of this? Was she an active agent, aware of what she was doing and what the information would be used for? Or had she been convinced of something lesser, an edited version of the story that made the betrayal seem acceptable? The difference mattered, not because it changed the fact of the breach of trust, which was real and hurt in a way Robert couldn't fully quantify yet, but because it determined what to do next. A person who chose to betray for self-interest is one thing. A person who was manipulated into betraying because someone exploited a vulnerability is another. And Marlene had vulnerabilities, Robert knew, because he had paid attention over 4 years. Her youngest son, Saul, 26, who had gotten into debt with a bad loan 2 years ago and was still trying to get back on his feet. The tight rental situation after the condo association fees increased at the beginning of the year. The way she sometimes stood by the kitchen window at the end of the day, with that expression of someone trying to solve a problem that wouldn't add up. Victor, or whoever had made the initial approach through Gerald Rivers, had chosen well. He had chosen someone who needed a way out and had access. This realization didn't alleviate the pain, but it added a layer of complexity Robert couldn't ignore. On Friday afternoon, Caleb showed up unannounced, which was rare. He arrived with that closed-off expression his father recognized as one he wore when he had something important to say, but hadn't yet decided how. They sat in the living room, and Caleb looked at his hands for a moment before speaking. He said he had met with a friend who worked at an accounting firm in the city, and that this friend had mentioned, without realizing the relevance, that Wallace Logistics had come up in a prospecting conversation the firm had had with a group of outside investors. There were no details, no confirmation. It was the kind of vague information that circulates in mid-sized cities where everyone knows everyone by second or third degree. But Caleb had found it strange and decided to tell him. Robert listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, he remained silent for a moment and then said his son had done right to tell him. Caleb asked if something was happening with the company. Robert said he was handling some matters, that there was no cause for concern, and that when he had more clarity, they would talk in more detail. Caleb looked at his father with those eyes that were identical to his own, and said, with a calm that surprised Robert, that he knew his father wouldn't ask for help before trying to solve it alone, but that he was available if needed. Not dramatically, with the direct simplicity of someone who knows the person they're talking to very well. Robert looked at his son for a moment that lasted longer than he intended. He said thank you in a way that wasn't just about that conversation. After Caleb left, Robert stayed in the living room for a while, without turning on the TV, without picking up his phone, without doing anything. The house was quiet. Marlene had left earlier, with an excuse about an engagement she rarely would have on a weekday, which was another sign that something had changed in her dynamic. It was in this silence that Robert made a decision he had been putting off since returning from the hospital. It was time to confront Marlene. Not in the explosive way that anger demanded, in the calculated way the situation required, not to accuse her without having the full story, but to open a crack in the wall between them and see what came out the other side. Because there was a possibility, small but real, that Marlene knew something he didn't yet. Something Victor had revealed without realizing, or that she had deduced over time, which could be the missing piece for Robert to truly understand what was at stake. And there was something else. Something he had noticed that week while reviewing the company's oldest documents, something that had lingered in the back of his mind without him having been able to fully grasp it yet. The contract Victor had photographed at the company, the one Priscilla had mentioned, was the same type of document that was in the drawer at home. But there was an important difference between the two. The one at home had a specific clause about the liquidation value of the partnership in case of compulsory exit, a clause Robert had inserted years ago after legal consultation that significantly protected his position in any dispute. If Victor had photographed the company document without realizing he was looking at an incomplete version, and if he was building a legal strategy based on that version, then he was building on the wrong foundation. Robert stood with this realization for a long moment. Then he went to bed earlier than usual, because he knew the following week would demand more of him than he had demanded of himself in a long time. And because he had learned over 58 years that the most important battles are not won with adrenaline, they are won with clarity, and clarity needs rest. What he didn't know yet was that on Monday morning, even before he left the house, Marlene would do something that would completely change the direction of everything. Monday began with a fine drizzle, the kind Austin occasionally received in October before the steady heat finally settled in. Robert woke before 6, which wasn't uncommon, and lay there listening to the sound of rain on the garden leaves for a few minutes before getting up. There was something about that sound that had always calmed him since childhood, a predictable rhythm in a world that rarely was. He went downstairs at 7 and found the kitchen empty. Marlene hadn't arrived yet. He made his own coffee for the first time in weeks, felt the insignificant weight of this simple task in a way he hadn't expected, and sat at the table looking out the window while the mug warmed his hands. At 7:20, he heard the gate. Then the footsteps on the stone path that led to the back entrance. Then the familiar sound of her purse being hung on the hook. And then Marlene appeared in the kitchen doorway, her shoulders damp from the walk from the bus stop to the house, and stopped when she saw Robert already seated. He said good morning. She said good morning. But she didn't go to the stove. She stood at the kitchen entrance with her purse still on her shoulder, as if she hadn't finished deciding whether to enter or not, and there was a rigidity throughout her body that Robert had never seen in that posture. Marlene was a woman who moved with that specific confidence of someone who knows her own space well. Now she seemed smaller within it. Robert said nothing. He waited. Marlene placed her purse on the counter with a slow gesture, looked at it for a second as if searching for words within it, and then turned to Robert and said she needed to talk to him. He gestured with his hand, indicating the chair opposite him at the table. She sat down. The rain continued outside. The kitchen clock ticked the second with that periodic click that had never bothered anyone and now seemed very loud. Marlene began to speak slowly, like someone removing a bandage and deciding that slower isn't necessarily gentler. She said she had done something wrong. She said she had known it from the beginning, but that she had convinced herself that what she was doing wouldn't truly hurt anyone, and that she had been foolish enough to believe that for too long. The story continues. Robert remained absolutely still, not because he was controlling himself, but because he had learned, in decades of negotiation, that the moment the other side decides to speak is the most fragile and most valuable moment, and that any interruption can close a door that took a long time to open. Marlene said his name was Gerald, that he lived on the same street as her, that he had knocked on her door one Sunday in August, 2 months before Robert's hospitalization, saying he was a representative of a group evaluating regional logistics companies and that he needed some basic information, nothing confidential, just to confirm data that was already partially public. She said he had offered money. Not a fortune, but enough to cover 3 months of her overdue rent and still have some left over to help her son Saul pay off part of the debt he had accumulated. She paused, looked at her own hands on the table. She said she had said no the first time, that she had said no the second time too, that on the third time Gerald had changed his argument. He said the information was necessary to protect the company's employees, that there were irregularities in management that could harm everyone, and that she was in a unique position to help the people who depended on that place. She said he had framed it in a way that seemed almost like a moral obligation. Robert closed his eyes for a second. He knew that technique. He had used it himself, years ago. In negotiations he preferred not to remember often. Marlene said she had accessed the documents 3 times, that she had written down the numbers Gerald had asked for and sent them to him via text message, that she had never photographed anything. She didn't know another person was doing that at the company. That after the second time, she had started to realize something was wrong, that Gerald's questions were becoming too specific, and that after the third time, she had stopped responding to his messages. She said that last week Gerald had appeared at her door again, this time not with money, with a veiled threat that if she didn't continue cooperating, he would find a way to make her name appear in any legal proceedings that arose, in a way that made it seem like she had acted on her own, out of personal interest, without anyone knowing she had been approached and pressured. That's when she had understood she was truly trapped. Robert remained silent for a time that must have seemed long to Marlene, though for him it had passed too quickly because he was processing the information in layers simultaneously. The confirmation of Gerald as an intermediary, which David had already uncovered. The nature of the approach, the emotional manipulation before the money, which was more sophisticated than he had expected from Victor. And the part that changed everything. Marlene had stopped. She had resisted. And she had come to talk before he needed to confront her. This didn't erase what had happened, but it changed how it happened. He asked her in a calm voice if she had kept anything from the conversations with Gerald, the messages, anything written. Marlene said yes, that she had deleted some out of fear, but that the last ones, the ones with the threat, were still on her phone. That she hadn't deleted them because she didn't know what to do with them, and because a part of her knew they might be important. Robert said he needed to see those messages. Not today, not now. That she should go home, stay calm, not respond to Gerald if he contacted her again, and come back the next morning with her cell phone. Marlene looked at him with an expression Robert hadn't seen on her before, a mixture of relief and shame that are 2 things that rarely appear at the same time on a face, but which, when they do, are unmistakable. She asked if he was going to fire her. Robert let the question hang in the air for a moment. Then he said he didn't know yet what he was going to do, but that at the moment he needed the messages more than he needed a decision about her employment, that she should go, that she should rest. Marlene stood up, grabbed her purse and left without making coffee, without preparing anything, exiting through the same door she had entered 20 minutes earlier. The gate clanged with that metallic sound Robert had heard thousands of times. He sat at the table for a long time after that. The rain had stopped. The kitchen was quiet, with the smell of coffee he himself had made, which was now cold in the cup. There was a different kind of weariness now, not the weariness of illness nor of suspicion, but that of someone who has just received information that reorganizes everything and needs a moment for the new map to settle. He called Theodore that same morning and told him what had happened. Theodore made that characteristic pause he had before any important answer, and then said that this changed the picture significantly. That if the messages proved coercion, Marlene's position shifted from participant to instrumental victim, and that this had direct implications on how the case could be built. He also said that Gerald Rivers' name added a layer that connected Victor to the scheme much more directly than the financial irregularities Priscilla had raised. He said he would need 48 hours. Robert hung up and went to the office. He opened the drawer. He stared at the documents for a moment. There was something almost ironic in the fact that the drawer that had started everything, that stack of papers Marlene had leafed through that Tuesday afternoon that felt like months ago but had been less than 3 weeks, was both the bait and the trap. The bait that had attracted Victor's attention to what he believed was a vulnerability. The trap because the documents he had photographed didn't tell the full story. He closed the drawer. That afternoon, David drove him to the company without Robert needing to ask. There was an important client meeting that couldn't be postponed, a freight contract that represented a significant portion of monthly revenue and was in the renewal phase. Robert entered the meeting room with that demeanor of someone who has nothing unusual happening, conducted the negotiation with his usual precision, closed the contract on better terms than the previous cycle, and left, shaking the client's hand with his usual firmness. Only in the car ride back, with David driving silently down the avenue that cut through the industrial district, did Robert feel the weight of everything that had happened in the past weeks settle all at once. He didn't cry. He had never cried easily, and that wasn't what he felt. It was more like the moment you stop holding something heavy and realize your arms had been trembling without you noticing. David asked, without taking his eyes off the road, if everything was okay. Robert said it was moving forward. David nodded, as if that were a complete answer, because for him, it was. The next morning, Marlene arrived at the exact time, cell phone in hand. They sat at the kitchen table again. She opened the conversations and slid the device across the table toward him without saying anything. Robert read each message calmly, from beginning to end, and photographed the screen of each one with his own cell phone. Gerald's messages were careful enough to never mention Victor by name, but they were explicit enough in their threat to leave no doubt about the nature of what had been done. When he finished, he returned the cell phone to Marlene. She asked what would happen now. Robert said that what needed to happen would happen, that she didn't need to do anything more than continue working normally, that if Gerald appeared again, she should say she was busy and not open the door, and that if he insisted, she should call Robert immediately. Marlene looked at him for a moment with that expression that mixed the two incompatible things, and then asked why he was doing this, why he wasn't simply firing her and handling the rest without her. Robert held the question for a moment. Then he said, with an honesty that surprised even himself, that he didn't fully know the answer yet, but that he had learned throughout his life that treating people who erred out of weakness differently from those who erred by choice was one of the few distinctions worth keeping. Marlene said nothing more. She went to the stove and began to prepare the ginger vegetable broth with those movements Robert knew by heart, and which at that moment seemed simultaneously the same and completely different from all other days. Theodore called that afternoon with what Robert had both expected and feared. There was a legal filing prepared by a lawyer he had been able to identify with a filing deadline for the following week, based on an allegation of contractual irregularity that used precisely the incomplete numbers from the photographed documents. Victor's plan was ready, and it was about to be executed. What Victor didn't know was that Robert was also ready. The week leading up to Victor's legal filing was the quietest Robert had lived in a long time, and it wasn't the empty silence of someone with nothing to do. It was the dense silence of someone doing a lot without anyone noticing. Theodore worked on one side, Priscilla worked on the other. David moved information from one place to another with that discretion that was worth more than any elaborate strategy. And Robert remained at the center of it all, coordinating without appearing, in the same way he had learned to manage the company in the early years, when he didn't yet have enough structure to delegate and needed to be the single thread connecting all parts without letting any know exactly how the others fit together. Theodore had requested the original documents, the complete ones, with the clauses that the photographed ones did not contain. Robert handed them over on a Tuesday afternoon at the lawyer's office, in a blue folder closed with an elastic band that had been at the bottom of the drawer for years, waiting for a need he had always hoped not to have. Theodore received them with the expression of someone who had already calculated the impact before opening them and said they were exactly what he needed. Priscilla had completed the financial report with the documented discrepancies over the 18 months. It was a 32-page document, organized with that precision that was the hallmark of her work, with each entry identified, each destination account traced as far as possible, and an executive summary on the first page that translated the numbers into clear language for non-specialists. She had done this in her own evenings at home, without using the company's systems so as not to leave digital traces that Victor could interpret as an early warning sign. Robert read the full report one afternoon, sitting in his home office with the pages spread across his desk. And when he finished, he stood for a long moment looking at the garden through the window. Marlene's begonias had opened more flowers that week, that vibrant orange contrasting with the dark green leaves. There was something almost disturbing about the beauty of the garden at that moment, as if the external world remained completely indifferent to the amount of things that had happened inside that house in the last month. On Thursday, 2 days before the deadline Theodore had identified for Victor's filing, Robert asked David to take him to the office earlier than usual. He arrived at 7:30 before any other employees and remained in the meeting room alone for almost an hour, with a cup of coffee he had made in the hallway machine and which grew cold before he finished it. He wasn't nervous. It was something different from nervousness. It was the specific concentration of someone about to play the last piece on a board he had set up over weeks. At 9 o'clock, Victor arrived with his characteristic long stride, the brown leather briefcase he used for all formal meetings, and the smile that appeared before his words. He found Robert already seated at the head of the table with Theodore beside him, and the expression on Victor's face changed in a subtle but unmistakable way. It wasn't surprise. It was the quick readjustment of someone who had expected to find one situation and found another. He sat down. He asked if there was a scheduled meeting he had missed. Robert said he hadn't scheduled one because he wanted to make sure Victor came. Then he slid a copy of Priscilla's report across the table and watched Victor's face as he looked at the first page. What happened in the next 40 minutes was less dramatic than Robert had imagined it would be, which was almost always the case when you prepare well for a confrontation. Victor tried 3 different approaches in sequence. First, he said the numbers had an explanation, that they were accounting adjustments that hadn't been communicated correctly. Theodore presented the original entries that disproved this. Next, he claimed there were irregularities on both sides, that the documents he had obtained proved issues with Robert's management. Theodore presented the complete contracts, with the clauses the photographed documents lacked, and calmly explained their legal implications. On his third attempt, Victor fell silent for a moment and then asked what Robert wanted. Robert said he wanted what he had always wanted: the company functioning, the employees protected, and a partnership dissolution that was legally clean and wouldn't cost either of them more than it already had. He said he didn't want lengthy lawsuits, no public exposure, no desire to destroy what they had built together just to prove a point. But if Victor filed any action based on the documents he had irregularly obtained, Robert would use everything he had, and he had plenty to respond in a way Victor wouldn't want to face. There was a clarity in that moment Robert hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't anger. It was the specific relief of someone who had spent too long holding something heavy and finally placed it on the table where it should have always been. Victor remained silent for a long time. He looked at Theodore. He looked at the documents. And then he looked at Robert with an expression that was the most honest Robert had seen on him in 12 years of partnership. The weariness of a man who had tried a move that didn't work and knew it was time to stop. He said he wanted his lawyer present for any formal agreement. Robert said that was reasonable. Theodore had already prepared a partnership dissolution proposal that protected both their interests within legal limits and that eliminated the need for any litigation if the conditions were accepted. Victor took the documents, said he would give a response in 48 hours. He left without the smile he had entered with. Robert remained in the meeting room after Victor left, with Theodore beside him, organizing papers with that silent efficiency. Through the room's window, which overlooked the internal courtyard where trucks were inspected before heading out en route, he could see two operations employees talking near a vehicle with its hood open, gesturing about some mechanical problem with the uncomplicated naturalness of someone solving one thing at a time. The company continued. The work continued. That was exactly what he had tried to protect all along. Theodore said, putting the last document into his briefcase, that it had been well handled. Robert thanked him without elaborating, because there wasn't much more to say. Victor responded in 30 hours, not 48. He accepted the conditions with a single alteration to the timeline for transferring his partnership stake, which Theodore deemed acceptable. The agreement was signed the following week, on an afternoon of fine drizzle, much like that Monday, when Marlene had sat at the kitchen table and begun to speak. Robert signed with the same pen he had used to sign the liability waiver at the hospital, which wasn't a planned detail but one that didn't escape his own notice. Regarding Gerald Rivers, Theodore had advised that the best course of action was a formal written warning documenting the coercion, with clear indication of the legal consequences of any future attempt at contact. Gerald received the document, acknowledged receipt through his own lawyer, and did not reappear. It was the kind of drama-free resolution Robert preferred, efficient, documented, and without needing to escalate beyond what the situation required. What remained, after everything, was the question of Marlene. Robert took 2 weeks to make a decision about her, which was a long time for a man who usually decided quickly. It wasn't indecision. It was the kind of care one takes when one knows the decision will matter in a way that goes beyond the practical. Marlene had committed a real breach of trust, motivated by financial pressure and manipulation, and had corrected her course when she realized the magnitude of what she was involved in. Both of these things were true simultaneously and needed to be addressed simultaneously. On a November morning, with the summer sun beginning to establish itself over Austin, Robert sat at the kitchen table before Marlene arrived and waited. When she entered and saw him, she stopped as she had stopped that Monday in October, with that rigidity of someone who doesn't know what they're about to hear. Robert said he had decided she could continue working in the house, if she wanted, that what had happened would remain between the two of them, no record, no legal action, no formal consequences. But there was a condition, that she never again kept anything that needed to be kept without telling him. That if anyone approached her again with any type of proposal related to him or the company, she should come speak directly to him, before anything else. Marlene looked at him for a moment that held a lot, and then said she understood. She said she was sorry, with that direct simplicity of someone not trying to elaborate, because she knew elaborating wouldn't change what had happened. Robert said he knew, and that was why he had made that decision. There was a difference between forgiving and trusting again, and Robert was honest enough with himself to know that both would need separate time. But there was also a wisdom he had accumulated in 58 years that said discarding everything a person was because of one thing she did at the most vulnerable moment of her life was a waste he wasn't interested in making. Marlene went to the stove and started the coffee, then the vegetable broth, then the toast she knew he liked on sunny mornings, and the kitchen filled with those smells Robert knew by heart, which had remained the same even when everything around had changed, and which now carried a different weight, no longer the naive weight from before, but the weight of something that had been tested and had survived the test, albeit with a scar that would take time to fade. Caleb came for dinner that weekend and found his father calmer than he had been in months. He asked if the company situation had been resolved. Robert said yes. Caleb didn't ask for details, because he knew his father well enough to know that the details would come when they were necessary, and was satisfied to see that lightness that had vanished during the weeks of hospitalization and silent tension returning to the shoulders of the man who was the only father he had. They had dinner with the television off, talking about small things, Caleb's school, a student who had surprised him on a test, a book Robert had started at the hospital and hadn't finished. The night was warm, with that humid November heat that called for a fan, and the windows were open, letting in the street noise, the neighbors, the dog that barked at the same time every day. When Caleb left, Robert stood on the porch for a while before going inside. The Austin sky on those November nights had a specific quality of depth, that dark that isn't closed but open, full of points the city can never completely erase. He stared at it for a time he didn't count. He had lost a partner who had become an adversary. He had discovered that the loyalty he believed he had built was more fragile than he thought in some places, and more solid than he expected in others. He had gone through a hospital, through a hallway with a suitcase in hand, through weeks of calculated silence and decisions made with the care of someone who knows that every move matters. And he had learned once more, and in a new way, that the things you build with 30 years of work don't fall because of a partner who decided to be dishonest. They fall when you stop paying attention. And he had paid attention. He went inside, closed the porch window, and went to sleep. For the first time in a long time, he slept without waking in the middle of the night.